Hi everyone, this is John from Tulip, and this video is the latest in a series of tutorials designed to show you how to incorporate feedback mechanisms into your applications. And specifically, in this one, we're going to build a series of steps and tables that allow us to calculate the Net Promoter Score of a given application. So let me show you really quickly what the finished product is going to look like. Okay, so the first thing we're going to do is we're going to build this application that allows us to calculate the NPS of other applications. So if I click on Instant Messenger here, that's an Instant Messenger application I've built, right? All of these are just simple tutorial applications that I've built before. And when I click on Calculate NPS, it's going to calculate the Net Promoter Score right there. So I'll click on a different one, click Calculate NPS, and it'll give us the score over here. Similarly, click on this one, and all the way through, it's going to give us the Net Promoter, like the name of the application here, the actual counts we're using to calculate the Net Promoter Score, and then our tabulated score over here. So if you're not familiar with Net Promoter Score is a way of measuring just sort of the overall positive sentiment or negative sentiment toward your application. So the way you would calculate it is you would ask a user to rate a given application, or it could be a product, it could be your whole company. The level of granularity is going to differ, but you ask a user to rate something on a scale of 1 to 10. So 1 would be least likely to recommend to appear, or like least satisfied, and 10 would be most likely to recommend to appear, or most satisfied. From there, you take those ratings and you break them down into 3 categories. The 1s through 6s are considered your detractors, people who are not likely to recommend your product or company to appear. The 9s and 10s are your promoters, people who are definitely going to recommend it. And you just bracket out the 8s and 9s, or so the 7 and 8s as neutrals. So from there, you take the percentage of your total responses that were promoters, and then subtract the percentage of total responses that were detractors, and that gives you your NPS. So from here, what we're going to build is that application for calculating it, and then 2 steps for actually collecting user feedback. So from here, I'm actually going to break into what we're going to build, how it works, and so let's build this application together. Okay, so just as a note before we get started, in this video, I'm going to assume that you already have the basics of Tulip under your belt. So if you don't have a really good command of tables, of triggers, of different variable types, and how to string different applications and steps together, then I would recommend you go back and take one of the more basic tutorial courses before we get started on this. I'll include a link in the description. But for right now, I'm going to gloss over a lot of stuff and just assume that you'll be able to put it together yourself. If you have questions, please ask them below, though. I'm more than happy to help out with anything. But with that said, let's actually talk about what we're going to build together. Okay, so the way this application is going to work is we're actually going to build 2 application steps, an application, and 2 tables. You can integrate this into your own table structure if you already have tables that would work for this, but for the purposes of this exercise, we're going to build a couple ourselves. So let me just run down this list really quickly. So for 1, we're going to store a table, or we're going to create a table that actually stores a list of applications. So right here, I've created a table that simply lists all the applications I'm using in the NPS score. So you can imagine having all of the applications in your instance incorporated into this table. You could use trigger logic and do something just like create a new record in this table if one doesn't exist every time you run an application for the first time, or you could put it in here manually. I have these fields in here because it's associated with a different application that stores binary feedback for liked and didn't like, but for right now, all you would need to do is build this table that stores a list of applications in each table record, or where each table record is a new application. So then we're going to create a table that stores NPS feedback. Let me show you that really quickly. So in this one, I have just a couple of fields. We have application, the user rating, the user, and some notes. What this is going to allow us to do is actually take that list of feedback by application or by user, and then filter it out to actually calculate and do the NPS score from there. Okay, so moving on here is where things are going to get a little bit more complicated. So from there, we're going to write a couple of table queries. So table queries is a new Tulip feature that allows you to actually filter and run aggregation functions over table data. It's super useful, and this is a great application of that new feature. So we're going to write table queries that allow us to filter out the data we need from our Net Promoter Score table and actually, create those buckets with promoters and detractors and allow us to actually use the expression editor in Tulip to write that little mathematical function that'll give us our NPS score. And then finally, we're going to create application steps for collecting user feedback and create an application for calculating and displaying NPS. It sounds like a lot, but this will come together quite quickly. And then once you see how all the parts fit together, it's not really that complicated. Okay, so In the next part, I can actually walk you through what this looks like under the hood, and we can see in a list what all the steps we're going to go through to produce this look like. Okay, so if you're a person who actually learns better by reading things, I've created this little write-up of how we're going to build this thing step by step. So you could take a second to screenshot this or create a copy of this some way, and that'll allow you to work through this on your own speed or to supplement the things that I'm going to show you in this video with sort of a text-based tutorial. Otherwise, let me just actually show you what we're doing. Okay, so the first things we're going to do are build 2 steps for simply collecting application ratings. The idea is at the end of an application that you're running, you would put this feedback step and it would allow the user to enter feedback. It would just be the sort of the terminal step in an application. So first one is this rating step. It looks pretty terrible from here with everything on top of one another, but if I just move forward here, you'll be able to see that this is sort of what it's going to look like. It's a rating 1 through 10. I'm just using an array variable to populate the single select options right here. And all this is doing is allowing us to pick an option, setting that selection to a variable. And when I click the submit button, it's going to upload that rating along with a couple other pieces of information like the name of the application and the user who submitted it to this our NPS table, right? So if that variable is not blank, we're just doing a couple data manipulation store. We're storing our application rating to this field over here. And then we're storing the name of the application here, the user there, and any notes. If there were any, great. So that's pretty straightforward. And then the other way of collecting this is simply by using variables. So, right, we can do it this way as well. This is another way I've seen NPS done. So how satisfied were you with this application? Each one of these buttons simply correspond or updates a variable that corresponds with the number. So if you click 1, it sets that variable to 1. And when you hit submit, it does the exact same operation as the previous. It just takes whatever value is in that variable and uploads it to the table. The great thing about both of these options is that they allow you to, you can just copy and paste these on any application. Like once you've built the underlying logic in these, there's no need to rebuild anything. You just sort of update the table structure and update the triggers so that it works for that particular application, but it's sort of like a build it once and then you're good. All right, so after we've built these 2 application steps, we're going to build our calculate NPS step. And I want to show you a couple things that are happening on this one. So for one, we're going to have this embedded table or embedded interactive table right here that's going to allow us to pick an application. When we click on here, it's going to set a variable with that application name. And then all of the exciting stuff happens. And this is where the meat of this tutorial is going to lie. So over here, you can see in the table records field that I have both record placeholders and I have these table queries. So this might look very new to you. This is a new feature that we're rolling out, but I will walk you through precisely how to do that. So basically what we're doing is we are filtering out promoters and then summing promoters from this table, filtering out the total number or counting the total number of responses by application in our Net Promoter Score table, and then filtering out detractors by application here. From there, we're doing some stuff under the hood, just a simple operation in the expression editor to update this application. And from there, all of this stuff works together. The 2 tables, the feedback steps, and this application give us sort of a holistic solution for calculating NPS. Okay, so I said enough. We have spent a lot of time talking about what we're going to build without actually building anything. So let's start building this application. Okay, so to get started, I'm just going to talk you through how to build these 2 tables and 2 steps for collecting data from users. Okay, so first things first, let's just build these 2 tables. For your applications table, all you need is a table that stores as individual unique records the names of your applications. It doesn't matter if you have even these liked or didn't like rows, just make sure that each row corresponds to a table you'd like to, or to an application that you'd like to calculate NPS for. So one way to do that would just be to create a piece of logic on all of your applications that does something like if the table list of apps does not have an ID with the name of this application in it, then create a table record that whose ID takes the name of that application. This is a great automated way to do it. It makes sure that there's no errors between manually typing in the name of an application, so there's no mistakes there. Or you could also just create records and manually type in the name of your applications too. That's fine. Then the other table you need to build is this Net Promoter Score table. So for right now, all you need to do is build a table that has a text column or a text field for application, a number field for user rating, a user field, and then feel free to either create or omit this notes field right here as a text field. We're not going to use it for this application. It could be useful to have, but like I said, the only fields you need right now are an ID, text for application, number for user rating, and then a user field for users. Okay, so let's look at how these two application collection steps are working. So again, I'm not actually going to build these for you right now. I'm just going to show you how they work. So for this first one, I have a single select menu right here. So data source where I'm storing this data is to a variable called application rating, and its input where it's actually getting these options from is from a variable called create the input array. So what I've done is on step open here, I'm using transitions runtime. So if you're not using transitions runtime, then just create a trigger where the inciting action is when the step opens. So all this is doing is loading a expression of a series of numbers into a variable called create the input array. When you're making this, make sure you're using decimals, so they're in like 10.0, 9.0, so it uploads as a number variable. Otherwise, it will default to an integer variable. But that's pretty straightforward right there. You just, oops, I accidentally reset that. I'm gonna jump out and not save this really quickly. So create that array, and then that array will feed the single select, and from the single select you use this this application rating variable. I also have this trigger right here just to create a new record every single time that this step opens, so that you're already creating that record right there, and then when you hit the submit button, you're just loading the information into that record you've already created. You could also attach this to the submit button as well, just an order of operations issue. So that's pretty straightforward. You set that variable, you set the single select, and then when you hit submit here, you just push the corresponding information into the appropriate fields in that NPS table, right? So again, you can look at this. It's just a couple data manipulation stores. The same principle is going to apply on this collect app rating step number 2, where if we look at what's happening on any of these buttons, all that's happening is we're doing a data manipulation store static value of the number corresponding with the number on the button into the variable user rating. And when we hit submit right here, we are creating that record. So like right here, you can see instead of doing it on step open, I'm doing on the submit button, we're creating that record. And then we're storing the variable application rating into the corresponding fields. So pretty straightforward right here. So if you want to take the opportunity to either copy either of these steps or build those, and to build the tables, now would be a great time to do so, because at this point we're going to actually start doing the table aggregation, or the table queries and all the aggregations we're going to need to do the calculation. In this part of the video, we're going to build the table queries that we're going to use to parse the data from this table and to actually support the operations that we want to perform in the application. So I'm not going to go too in-depth on how to use table queries. This is a relatively new feature, and there'll be a lot more tutorial content to come on this soon to show you the ins and outs and actually everything you can do with it. But for right now, I just want to show you how to support this particular use case with table queries. Okay, so the way we're going to use this is we're going to differentiate between queries on the one hand and aggregations on the other. So if we click on query and create a query, this is going to allow us to order and sort through different information in this table. So we can apply filters to our data in this table, we can add a sort to it, or we could, set a limit to the number of rows that we want. And when we're using aggregations, we can actually, put sort of operations that we want to perform on top of our given queries. So, that's pretty abstract, but let me show you what this is actually going to look like in practice. Okay, so the actual things that we want to do in this table is we want to create our buckets for our Net Promoter Score. We want to create the promoter bucket, so anybody whose rating is a 9 or a 10. And then we want to create our detractors bucket, so that is anybody whose rating is 6 or below. And we can do that using queries pretty easily. So I'm going to create a new query. I'll call it promoter. And because what we want to do is we want to filter out all of the entries that don't meet two criteria. One, like they need to meet the criteria that they belong to a particular application. And then 2, they need to meet the criteria that they have the correct score. And for promoters, it's 9 or above. We're going to set a filter that says the user ID, not the user ID, but we're going to set it to user rating, is greater than or equal to static value 9. Great, so that's already going to give us this filter we're going to need. So pretty straightforward from there. And then the next thing we're going to do is set a filter that is application name equals app input. And this is going to allow us to actually use that embedded interactive table to sort through applications by name. So these are the filters we need for this one. We've set up our promoters filter. I'm going to save that really quickly. And now I'm going to add another query for detractors and for total, because those are the 3 that we're going to need. So I'm going to create a new query. We'll call this one, sorry, I need to exit this first. Create a new one. We'll call this detractors. And I will go through the exact same operation as I did before. So I'll add a filter, and this one, user rating, will be equal to, or sorry, not equal to, it'll be less than or equal to, what is happening? Okay. Less than or equal to static value 6. And then we'll add one more filter, which is application name equals app input. I'll save that. And then I'm going to create a final query, and we'll call it total. And from there, all we need to do is, because we're not actually filtering anything, we just need to make application name equal to app input. This is going to allow us to set a variable in the application with the name of an application, and then we'll be able to filter within this query from there. Okay, so that's the query. And now we're going to move on to the second set, which is actually aggregation. So if I click on this, we're going to be able to add the kinds of aggregation functions you'd expect from a program like SQL, or the kind of a more complex tool like SQL. So the options we're going to have here are pretty straightforward. So you'll recognize these if you spend a lot of time in analytics. So just average, count, max, min, mode, sum, etc. So because we're doing NPS and we want to count the number of people who've given us a particular rating, we're going to just set it to count, and we'll call this count responses. We'll hit save. And from there, we are set up in our table queries. The next step is actually going to be to attach these to our application, and I'll show you how to do that now. All right, so the next step is actually to use those table queries we just wrote to support our calculation of NPS in this application. So the first step here is to create record placeholders for each of those tables. All right, so we can add a table here. We can add our list of applications table. And then we're going to add our Net Promoter Score tutorial table. And for right now, we only need to add a record placeholder to this list of applications table. So we can call it get current list of apps would be good. Or let's call it currently selected app. Currently selected app, because we're going to use this to feed a variable that's going to then allow us to filter out in our queries. And then if we're going to use this NPS tutorial table a bunch, but we don't need a record placeholder for it right now. If we were going to update those steps where we needed to actually push information into it, then we need a record placeholder. But for right now, I don't think we need to create one. I might be wrong. We'll find out. Okay, so from here, the next step is to create an interactive table in your application. So you can go ahead and just create an interactive table. And the way I would like you to actually populate it is by going to Data Source, Tulip Table, and then selecting that list of applications table. Make sure you select your record placeholder of currently selected app. And then this is really important, because what this interactive table is going to allow you to do is click on one of these applications, and we're going to use that click to support a piece of trigger logic. So we don't need to worry about filters. We don't need to worry about sorting or anything right now. What we're going to want to do is go down to triggers, and we're going to want to set a variable right now. So I have this trigger node called set variable. And what we're going to do is, so when a row is selected, when we click on a particular entry in that table, we're going to do data manipulation store table record, and we want to pick currently selected app. We'll go by the ID, because that ID is the name of the application, and we're going to store it into the variable currently selected application. If you need to make that variable, go ahead and make that variable right now. Just make sure it's the same data type as your ID column, and you're good. Some of this stuff I've already have built into this application. I just want you to see how the general logic is working. The important part of this step is that you're actually taking the name of the application you selected from that interactive table and storing it in a variable. Great, so let's move on. Next step is actually to set up the table queries now. So let me show you how to do that. All right, so just like we need to bring table information into our applications by using record placeholders, we need to do a similar process for bringing queries into our application. So I'm going to move myself over here and let's get started adding this query. So you'll see over here, just above record placeholder, I have this option to add a query. So I'm going to go down to my NPS tutorial table right here, and I'm going to start adding those queries that we built in the table itself. So click right here. We can call this one promoters. Just however you're going to reference those queries that we made before. Usually it's good to have the same name. So we can call it promoters. And then we're going to have an option right here. So we can already see that the information that we put in, the settings we made for those queries are populating down here. So the filters are user ratings is greater than 9. And then this is that super important part I was referencing before where the application name equals. And now we need to set something, some input from this application name to be that equivalency for the application name column in our table. So what we're going to do is we're going to set it as a variable and currently selected application. So this is going to do a really important thing. So we're setting that variable, we're setting the value in currently selected application by clicking on the name of the application in our interactive table. And then we're using the value in there to filter out from our table query. All right, so what that's going to allow us to do is select both applications, or select application names from this column. So we can actually, we can store all of the feedback for all of our applications in a single table structure and select out the promoters from that single application. Great, so click add there. And now we're going to add another one. We're going to add another query for detractors. So we'll call this one detractors. And we'll call this one detractors. And we'll do the exact same thing. Equals variable currently selected application. So then it looks like I never saved when I made the total one. So I'm going to just pause real quick, go back and do that and jump back in. Okay, so I've added that totals query already. So we can just call it total. Set it to total. And again, application input from the variable currently selected variable. All right, so now we made that. Now we need to add an aggregation to it. Now we need to add some sort of operation that actually goes through and gives us the information we want. And so we created a single aggregation in our table. We created that count aggregation. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to apply that count aggregation to our table queries. So the queries filter the data, they put it in the state we'd like it for some further operation, and then the aggregation is just that further operation. So here, I'll just add an operation, call this count promoters. You can add count responses, call it count detractors. We'll add the similar count. We only have a single count aggregation going, and then we'll call this one count response, or call this one count total. Great. And so now one way we can check if this works is just by going into developer mode and seeing if, well, first I have these variables right here. So I often, I think it's a really good idea to use variables to make sure that your application is updating with the right information as you're building. Obviously in a production setting, you would take these out. It's not going to give you useful information necessarily, but for right now, this is a really great way to see whether or not our application is doing what it's supposed to be doing. And developer mode is also going to give us a way to see this, but we just need to set the variable first. So I just have this as an embedded variable. We can set the data source as a table aggregation now, which is, I think, a super useful thing. So we'll go to table aggregation and we'll set this one as count promoters, set this one as count detractors, and set this one as count total. All right, so developer mode should be open at this point. PS tutorial, everything should be set basically to 0 at this stage. So now the trick, okay, so it's counting everything. It's counting all the entries in there. So now the trick is if this is going to filter out once I click on a row and set the variable to current application. Great. So, all right, this app is update, or this variable over here is updating with the name. Great. So our query is doing exactly what it's supposed to. So you can see it's filtering out information. And if we were to go back into the table itself, we would see that we have exactly this many rows with these specific ratings. And the next step from here is literally just going to be to put a simple piece of math in the expression editor, and that's going to allow us to calculate NPS. So let me show you how to do that right now. Okay, so up to this point, we've done a lot of work just to get the data we need in the form that we needed. At this point, all we have to do is just a simple mathematical operation to actually calculate the NPS. So the first thing you need to do is just create a variable really quickly that we can put somewhere on your application to display NPS. Because what we're going to do is we're going to put a piece of math in the expression editor and store that to this variable. So let's write that together really quickly. So I've scrubbed out the logic really quickly right here, and so let's build this trigger together. So what we're going to do is we can do data manipulation store. We're going to put our calculation in the expression editor, and then we're going to put that expression in our display NPS variable. All right, so we'll do @table ag. Great thing, in the expression editor, you can just access your table aggregations right here as you would any other piece of application information. So we'll then just go through the calculation right there. So the number of promoters divided by the total, subtracted from the number of, about to sneeze, number of detractors. There it goes. Table aggregation, detractors divided by the total number, close this off, multiply it by 100 so we don't have to deal with decimals, and we'll store it to a variable display NPS. So then I'll move myself really quickly, save this, and we can go back into developer mode and see if this piece of logic is working. So we'll click on simple yes no feedback step, calculate NPS, and beautiful, it's doing it. And you can see this one's pretty simple. So because it's out of 10, it would be 30% minus 40%, which would give us negative 10. So you can go to this one and on down the line. So as you can see, all of our counts are updating, our table queries, and we are calculating NPS in real time. So this has been a lot for a very simple application, but I think often when we're building software or when we're building applications, that's kind of what comes with the job. You have to do a lot to get the data you need, and then once you have the data, it's actually quite simple to put it in the, do the calculations you're looking for. So this has been a lot to pull this into one place, but once you sort of get the gist behind this of storing your data in particular tables that have structures that work for you, displaying that information in your applications, and then using trigger logic to perform those calculations, there's so much stuff you can do. So from here, I just want to recap really quickly what we did, and then you can be on your way and building this application. Okay, so just to really quickly recap what we've done in this tutorial. So the first thing we did is we created tables that store our application ratings from users and a list of applications, both of which are going to allow us to actually filter and do that calculation of NPS in an application. Then we built 2 application steps that we can append to any application for collecting user ratings. So for one, we used a single select menu and an array variable, and in another we used buttons, both of which operate on the same principle, that when you pick one of these options, you just push that value to a variable and then take whatever value is currently in that variable and push it into our user ratings table. Okay, so from there, we added table queries to our table. So we went through and we added queries that filtered out promoter scores, detractor scores, and totals, and allowed us to, going into the application editor, to filter those queries by the selected application, and then run our aggregation of our count aggregation on top of that. And then finally, from there, we built a piece of logic that, given the value currently in those aggregations, calculated the net promoter score. Okay, so again, there's not really a lot of complex stuff happening in this application, but it does use that new feature of table queries, which, if you're not familiar with, can actually pose a little bit of difficulty in actually executing this. So overall, that's how you build in NPS collector and calculator in Tulip. If you have any questions, do reach out, ask. I'm more than happy to break down and further explain anything I've done in this application. Okay, so that's it. I hope you have a great rest of your day.